Reminder, today's conference is being recorded.
If you're having any technical difficulties, please send us a direct message in the chat box along the left-hand side of your screen. This chat box is where everyone will have a chance to ask questions and interact with our presenters as well as each other. And please feel free to ask questions if you have any along the way. At any point, we'll make sure we get to them either right away or during the question and answer period. The series and today's webinar, Addressing Nature's Water Needs, the Science, Policy, and Politics of Environmental Flows, have been organized in partnership with the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, Canadian Water Network, Water Canada, and SSHRC. We would like to take this opportunity to also thank our partners for their support throughout the entire series, and it's partnerships like these that really allow us to try new methods of communicating important work to the water community. The Creating a Blue Dialogue series has been hosted by the Polis Project on Ecological Governance and the Living Water Policy Project. It is drawing to a close, but stay tuned for future events. And we would also like to thank all our participants who have joined us over the series and have contributed in creating a better dialogue in Canadian water policy. Today's webinar will examine if and how environmental flows are being adequately met in Canadian rivers. Environmental flows, also known as in-stream flow needs, refers to the quantity, timing, and quality of water required to sustain freshwater ecosystem, and the livelihoods and well-being of people dependent on them. Our speakers will provide an introduction to the scientific principles of environmental flows and then discuss the policy frameworks and decision-making processes that govern the protection and restoration of environmental flows in Canada. An essential document of both the webinar and environmental flow work being done in Canada is the WWF Canada Rivers at Risk report that we sent to everyone yesterday. It will also be on our website, and I believe our speakers will be referring to it throughout their presentation. So, let me introduce our speakers. And I'll introduce both of our speakers so that they can do their whole entire presentation without interruption. So Matt LaBelle is the Water Management Advisor at WWF Canada, and Matt's focus is the protection and restoration of environmental flows. He has experience working on a number of water management and conservation challenges, and Matt holds an MA degree from the University of Saskatchewan and has studied environmental flows, principles, and methodologies at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. Recently, Matt has been involved in the development of a water management framework for the lower Athabasca River. Tony Mass is a WWF Canada's Freshwater Director. He leads the overall design and delivery of the freshwater program and advocates WWF's position and perspectives on freshwater in the media, in government relations, and in partnership with various stakeholders. He is an active member and former co-chair on the Forum for Leadership on Water, a collaborative of Canadian water experts. Tony joined WWF in September 2007 after spending 5 years at Polis and has studied environmental technology at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, environmental science at Royal Roads, and at the University of Victoria, water governance at the School of Planning. And his work is inspired by the time he spends paddling Canada's lakes and rivers with his wife Carol, and by his desire to share these experiences with his son Ezzy. Okay, I am going to pass the baton off to Matt and Tony now, and I'll just take a moment to flip onto their PowerPoint and get them organized.
And there it is.
And it is. And Tony, we're just letting a bunch of people into the room right now, so
that means maybe it is projected.
If you can just hold for a moment, there might be some beeps.
Hey, give me the green light, and I'll hold the light until you tell me to go.
Yeah, that's good.
And I just want to confirm, I see a lot of 416 and 403 numbers that aren't muted. So if you could, sorry, just once more, *6 to mute your line so that we can't hear your background noise.
I think that's how it's not muted. Yeah. All right, good job, Angie. That's still not in the conference stuff. That's what they're just saying, everybody in the room.
So again, on your phone, for those chatting in the background, I'm glad you're chatting. I hope you're going to enjoy the webinar. Just *6 so that our speakers won't get interrupted. All right, Tony, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. Is that how you want the presentation? You want your outline showing?
Nope, that's fine.
Okay, great. I'll let you take the reins.
All right. So, first of all, thanks to everyone for taking some time out to hear Matt and I talk about our favorite topic, environmental flows. Thanks to Polis, Liz, their supporters, funders for putting this great series together. It's a pleasure and an honor to have an opportunity to do this. And I'll just say hello from the other side of the coast from where Liz is. I'm actually in Halifax at the moment, beautiful sunny Halifax. We're out here for WWF Canada's Halifax or Atlantic office 10th anniversary last night. So we're spanning time zones. I'm on the East Coast, Matt's in Alberta. So you're getting WWFers from across the country. Get on the arrow here. We're going to tag team on the agenda, Matt and I. So I will start by setting the context. Matt's then going to take over for a little while and blind you with science, the science of environmental flows. I'm going to take over then again and talk about some of the policy and politics that we've experienced and that we're seeing around this issue in Canada and globally. And then we're both going to take your questions and we will do our best to also try to answer them. So I used to start my presentations on environmental flows with a much more technical textbook definition of environmental flows, but I started using this one to kick things off. And this is a quote from Martin Mittelstadt from the Globe and Mail. And actually this is in reference to an article he wrote on our report that Liz mentioned, Canada's Rivers at Risk. And he describes, I think, environmental flows very nicely as the seasonal waxing and waning of rivers, and that it is one of nature's most crucial cycles, and that it influences everything from the success of salmon runs to having enough water during parched summers to irrigate crops. It's very much at the heart of water management, but a very new, in Canada in particular, concept in terms of really finding its way into water policy in particular. When we begin to tinker too much with that seasonal waxing and waning, of course, bad things start to happen. And this is a graph from a WWF report that we release every 2 years on a global scale called the Living Planet Report. And this is a very high-level, rolled-up index of freshwater biodiversity on the planet. And what this is showing is that in the last, since 1970, on a global scale, freshwater biodiversity has declined by 35%. And one of the interesting things about that report, and if you have a look at it, we do that in partnership with the Zoological Society of London. If you look at that report, you'll see that when you compare the biodiversity indices of freshwater systems and compare those to marine and terrestrial systems, you see that the one in most significant decline is actually the freshwater index. So again, that's available online. Living Planet Report would be the best way to Google it up because it's probably on a WWF Global website. If you're not, if you don't think about these issues in terms of graphs and data so much, we can also think about what happens when we alter flows too much in terms of pictures. And this first shot is a shot of what should be China's Yellow River, but it's running dry, and that is someone doing their morning stretches on the bed of the dried-up Yellow River. Another example, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, falters, does no longer reach the sea every year when it once did. You can actually, if you look under the bridge, you can see the sea in the background, but the river in many years does no longer reach its mouth into the sea. And of course, here in Canada, one of our most challenged rivers with respect to environmental flows is the South Saskatchewan, which is in one of the most arid parts of the province, or of the country, of course. This is a picture that was sent to me from a supporter of WWF who was taking off from an airplane and had just read, or at least seen, our Rivers at Risk report. So it's an interesting one to use, not the highest quality, but a great shot of the river from above. So, of course, I like to use that new definition that Martin Mittelstadt has provided us, but it's also worthwhile, I think, sharing the textbook definition. We use, as many organizations working on this ourselves, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, tend to use this definition of environmental flows that comes from something called the Brisbane Declaration. And the Brisbane Declaration is a global call to action to protect and restore river health. That definition defines environmental flows as the quantity, timing, and quality of water required to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems, and of course, importantly, the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on them. So we like to say that this is not just about water for nature, but it's actually about water for nature and water for people. We often have to try to explain what is technical and sometimes confusing and new concept to our supporters, to our donors. And what we've done is drawn an analogy to blood pressure. So what we say often is that just like blood pressure in the human body, the flow and movement of water is a vital indicator and driver of river health or overall ecosystem health. I've mentioned this report. And Liz mentioned it in the introduction. This is available online at www.ca/rivers, and I guess on the POLIS website now as well, or the Living Water Policy Project. Essentially, what we did in this report is looked at the major threats or the major threats to environmental flows and how they come together in terms of cumulative impacts. I will caution that this is not a report in which we went through reams and reams of data on species or habitat impacts, but more a literature review that was intended to frame the issue in a Canadian context. So we look at these three key major threats that are the same threats that many that look at this issue consider around the world. Flow regulation and fragmentation by, of course, dams, whether they're for hydropower or storage, and then, of course, navigation infrastructure when you think about the St. Lawrence Seaway is something important to consider. Water withdrawals or water allocations, be they for cities, industry, or agriculture, and, of course, impacts associated with climate change. And I've used this quote from a paper by some pretty eminent climatologists and hydrologists that came out a couple of years ago where they claimed that stationarity is dead. And what they're saying simply is that in the past, hydrology relied on past trends to predict future conditions, and that no longer is viable given the fact that the climate is changing, and so too then is our hydrology. So we tend to talk, when we talk about climate change impacts, and our conservation work at WWF is now having to do conservation on the move. So again, stationarity cannot be presumed any longer, and those climate change impacts can, show up in terms of both more water, floods, but also droughts, storms, more frequent and more extreme. This is a summary of the Rivers at Risk report. We hand-picked essentially 10 rivers and had a look at them based on those three threats. We rolled it up to some indicators that are these colored arrows, and we based these roughly on frameworks for river health that are used in places like the European Union and South Africa, where they report on river health at a rolled up way in the way we have here. I won't go into detail. I encourage you, if you haven't, to have a look at the report. We tried to make it as readable and short and visually appealing as we can. So have a look, and if you have comments, concerns, or interests, feel free to get in touch with us down the road. The notion of environmental flows, or setting water aside for nature, is really a foundation of sustainable water management. And this definition comes from Brian Richter at the Nature Conservancy, who suggests that sustainable water use or sustainable water management must achieve four things simultaneously. Of course, meet basic human needs, including sanitation and food, protecting freshwater ecosystems and sustaining the values and services they provide. That's very much where the environmental flows piece fits. And using the remaining of water efficiently to serve the broadest possible array of socially valued purposes. And of course, in sustainability language, we're always trying to ensure that we look out for future generations in our management efforts. Brian Richter and Sandra Postel, a couple of well-known water experts globally, translated that thinking into this kind of conceptual model of sustainable water management. So what they say is, when we're thinking about environmental flows and sustainable water use, we need to be thinking in terms of the sustainability boundary, and that the human water footprint needs to stay within that sustainability boundary if we want to secure the health of freshwater ecosystems and the many benefits that they provide. So, in essence, this is putting a limit on, in the context of environmental flows, the degree to which we can modify flows and levels before ecosystem services are negatively impacted. And those modifications, of course, come through the cumulative impacts of changes to flows by dams and other infrastructure, water withdrawals, particularly those where you don't have significant return flows, and through the changing climate, the changing hydrology related to climate change. So with that as context, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Matt, who will go into some further detail around the science and management issues related to environmental flows. So over to you, Matt. I hope. Matt, are you muted?
I think Matt must be muted, and it might be because he's dialed in on a phone number rather through his name. Tony, do you know his area code? And I'll quickly unmute him.
Yes, give me 1 second. Seven eight zero, I believe. Yeah, 780 is the area code.
I see him. Matt, you're coming. Don't worry, I'll get you unmuted.
Okay, Liz, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. There you go.
All right, sorry about that. So,
No, it's okay.
okay, so just taking a quick step back, when we refer to environmental flows, it's the same concept that's referred to elsewhere in Western North America and Western Canada as in-stream flow needs. And so as Tony mentioned, I'm just going to go over some of the prevailing, science principles that used to manage and define environmental flows. And a good place to start is the natural flow paradigm. And there's a wide acceptance that the natural flow regime is the primary determinant of the structure and function of aquatic and riparian ecosystems for streams and rivers. And so if conservation of native biodiversity and ecosystem integrity are objectives of environmental flow prescriptions, then they must accommodate the natural flow paradigm. However, translating this into a management framework is a challenge, as for example, the natural flow paradigm is not recognized as a determination method for environmental flows. But at the same time, this is the template to emulate for environmental flow management. And so, as I mentioned, flow is the master variable, or the maestro that orchestrates patterns and processes in rivers. But there are 5 interrelated riverine components that best describe river systems and should be considered in environmental flow assessments. And here we're referring to geomorphology, such as channel formation and maintenance, sediment transport, scour, and deposition. So the biological community composition, aquatic and terrestrial species, life histories, and habitat, water quality, so dissolved oxygen and temperature, and connectivity of the system over time, and longitudinal connectivity from river mouth to source, lateral and vertical with its floodplain. And in environmental flow assessments, you really need to look at both open water and in Canada, ice-covered observations. So different components of the flow regime have distinct functions, and maintaining that functional diversity and interconnectivity will result in habitat diversity as well as species diversity. And the assumption there is that natural variability of flows have shaped aquatic ecosystems over thousands of years, and the species associated with these systems have adapted to take advantage of the diversity. So you can see that different components of the flow regime have served those different functions, and that a change in average flows or annual flows, even if no change is made there could be changes to other flow regime which will in turn affect the ecosystem. And so environmental flow determinations should reflect that seasonal pattern, and 5 key components of that natural flow regime are magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate of change. And so what we're referring to there for magnitude is the amount of water moving through a river. Frequency is the number of flow events of a given magnitude per time interval, per period of time. The duration is the length of time associated with a particular flow event. Timing is the occurrence of flow event and their predictability, whereas rate of change is how rapidly flow changes in magnitude. Okay, and so now with those general concepts in mind, here's just an example of one species, Arctic grayling, and the flow requirements for different life stages. And you can see that that species has adapted through its life history to take advantage of different flow events and is reliant on those to complete its life history. And for example, the high flows in spawning improve habitat conditions, such as scouring sediment and moving it along. And a Canadian example of this that was from Montana is and applied to a species, and this is Atlantic salmon in western Newfoundland. And this graph has a lot going on in it, so I'm going to use the pointer. But I guess the gray shading at the back is natural flows, and the dotted line on top here, that's a flow regime that's been optimized for Atlantic salmon. And the line in black there is a managed flow regime for Atlantic salmon, as well as meeting hydropower requirements, or conceptually, of course. So you can see that natural flow regime can be emulated to not just to protect the ecosystem, but also to meet other water needs of humans, and in this case, hydropower. But for environmental flows, we're not just talking about fish, and there's widespread acceptance by environmental flow practitioners that we need to consider all the components of the aquatic ecosystem in defining environmental flows. However, I should note that there's no broadly accepted method for combining different ecosystem components, and this does require interdisciplinary studies. And we go back to that slide I showed earlier of the 5 different interrelated riverine components to assess all those components of the aquatic ecosystem. And if we look at a Canadian example, this is from the South Saskatchewan River Basin. And we see fish habitat, riparian vegetation, and water quality combined to produce an integrated or a more holistic environmental flow recommendation. And essentially what's been done here is the component of the ecosystem with the highest water flow requirement has been selected for the integrated ecosystem environmental flow recommendation, or IFN, in-stream flow needs. And now kind of moving, hold on one second. Here we go. So now moving from refining that sustainability boundary that Tony showed is another, a further development in it, and this is the sustainability boundary approach proposed by Brian Richter of the Nature Conservancy, where it proposes limits on the extent to which water withdrawals and discharges, such as water infrastructure operation, land uses, can alter natural variability in flows and water chemistry. These sustainabilities will need to be determined by different environmental flow methodologies, and the boundaries themselves should be dynamic. But here's a conceptual approach to looking at environmental flows. And another thing to note from there is that too much water in some cases can be damaging to ecosystem health. We often consider just reductions, but increases in flows can also have negative impacts. Unnatural increases in flows, I should say. And so one component that I think I've shown in previous slides that for environmental flows, we're really looking in variability. So we're not interested in just one minimum or base flow for a river across time. We're looking at, we need to maintain that natural variability. But one fundamental component of environmental flow recommendations or assessments is the presence of an ecosystem base flow or a low flow below which the aquatic ecosystem requires all the available water. And these are designed to protect the aquatic ecosystem when it's most sensitive. So they're really fundamental to any environmental flow recommendation or policy that aims to balance or to meet, I should say, social, economic, and environmental interests. And this is just a conceptual look at them. The argument can definitely be made that ecosystem base flows should be applied throughout the year, not just during that sensitive low flow period as expressed in this graph as kind of one line throughout. So that's sometimes that's confused with ecosystem base flow is confused with environmental flow, but just want to stress that that's one very important component, but it's not the only thing that's important when managing environmental flows. So I've kind of mentioned the fact that there's no preferred or gold standard in terms of environmental flow assessments, as in fact there are over 200 different types of methodologies that have been used. They can be grouped into four main categories. Hydrological are the simplest group, and they're very rapid and non-resource intensive and consist of working with hydrologic data. Hydraulic rating, that's where we have a quantifiable relationship between flow and the aquatic resource. And some of those examples of a hydraulic method would be wetted perimeter, maximum depth. So they're surrogates for habitat factors that are known or assumed to be limiting. From hydraulic methods evolved into habitat simulation, which are commonly used, and that's a detailed analysis of the quantity and suitability of habitat, usually defined in terms of depth of the water, velocity, and substrate. And these are then linked with habitat information of target species, and usually fish species are the ones that are used here. And kind of the evolution in environmental flow methodologies that have occurred in recent years, particularly in Australia and South Africa, are holistic methodologies. And these are address the entire ecosystem. They focus on flow events, and they might utilize the other hydrological and hydraulic tools that were mentioned above. So yeah, just once again, I just want to state that there's no right way to assess environmental flows. The context and everything, and choice will depend on urgency, the resources that are available, the complexity of the system, and the difficulty in implementation. And lastly, implementation should be an adaptive process, and I'll get to that in a slide coming up. So as I don't need to state the obvious, but rivers are dynamic, and there's many different types of rivers, and different rivers provide different habitats. And one environmental flow recommendation or assessment for one river not necessarily applicable to other systems. However, that being said, there is a movement towards developing regional environmental flow standards in rivers in the same geographic region and same kind of characteristics, but environmental flows should be developed based on the geographic region of that river. And why is this? Well, there's many different types of flow regimes, and these four flow regimes aren't reflective of the previous rivers on the last slide, but these are only just a small fraction of the types of flow regimes that are characteristic of different types of rivers. And these, not surprisingly, as flow drives processes in rivers, different flow regimes will drive different processes, and this is why environmental flows are really a river or regional river specific. So there is a good understanding of flow and ecology relationships, but at the same time, it's widely acknowledged that there is uncertainty in assessing the response of aquatic ecosystem to a given change in flow. And what these three kind of graphs are showing, A, B, and C, is hypothesis of a response of the ecosystem to a given change in flow. And under A, you can see that regardless of the amount of water left in the river, one hypothesis is that the response of the ecosystem remains steady. Whereas B, the B graph shows you that the response is fairly steady until you reach a certain break point at which, in lower flows, at which point there's more impact to the ecosystem. And another hypothesis is ecosystem response is fairly steady and increases as flow decreases. So there's no break point. It's not steady. It's a response as flow decreases, impact gets more and more severe. And this is just a subset of potential impacts. There's many more hypotheses that could be developed. But I think why I'm showing this slide is that there is uncertainty in environmental flow recommendations, and so that should suggest that we exercise precaution when implementing environmental flows policy. Absence of proof is not a proof of absence of effect. So the more uncertainty in environmental flow precautions, the more we should proceed with precaution when developing water withdrawal rules or operations. Okay, a couple more slides, and this one just wanted to show up and again stating the obvious that groundwater and surface water are a single resource, and conjunctive management should be in place to protect environmental flows. Almost all the water in rivers and streams is derived from groundwater, and for part or most of their lives, many stream fish and other species are tied to groundwater. So shifting our water demands from surface water to groundwater might not resolve our environmental flows issues, as these are highly connected systems, and with groundwater connections to surface water, we're essentially pulling from that same resource. As Tony mentioned, there is a fair bit of evidence in many river systems that flow regimes are beginning to change. And why that's important for environmental flows is that typically in the past, the recorded flow regime has been assumed to continue on in the future. And so water use operations are often tested against the past flow regime to see what their potential impact would be in the future. And so one important thing that a component of environmental flow assessment should be to test water operations against a range of potential flow scenarios, just to see how ecosystem objectives would they or would they not be met given changes in flow regimes. So essentially, we're testing the assumptions of the past continuing on into the future. And last slide. As I mentioned earlier, a fundamental component of implementing environmental flows is following the adaptive management cycle. So start off with implementing environmental flows, monitor, evaluate, and then implement adjustments where needed or continue on that course. And monitoring is just a key component of resource management, and it allows to see whether management decisions that were made are continuing on the right course. So are they resulting in an acceptable income, or do they need to be adjusted? And it also recognizes that, as I showed 3 slides earlier, that there is uncertainty in response of the ecosystem to changes in flow, and we don't have a full understanding of this at this point, and monitoring is one way to sort of improve ecological knowledge over time. And so after that blitz of slides, I'm going to pass the baton back over to Tony.
All right. I'm online, Liz. Good? You can hear me? Okay.
Yep, everything sounds good.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to pick it up from there and move the conversation for the next few slides before we get into questions and conversations, from moving from the science and management discussion to the policy and politics of environmental flows. I think just start by kind of reiterating that in some respects, focusing first on environmental flows in water management it kind of turns water management a bit on its head from our traditional approach. You know, it's kind of forcing us to ask first, how much water do we need to leave in place to keep an ecosystem healthy to get the benefits that we derive from that? And then working within what's left in terms of when we allocate and manage water to keep it within that limit. So, you know, our past tradition has been to kind of give nature the leftovers. And what we're saying here is that what needs to happen really to be sustainable is to first factor in what nature needs, and then for us to live and work within those limitations. This is a great quote from the In-Stream Flow Council that kind of hits the nail right on the head when you move from the science and management conversation into the decision-making side of things, that it actually boils down to a judgment of what kind of world, or what we want our world to look like. All the science and models that we use are critically important to providing the information upon which we make decisions. But because it boils down to what kind of world we want, these decisions are often very political and fall in squarely in the world of policy planning and politics. And I'll just note that this comes from a group of the In-Stream Flow Council is a group of government, U.S. and Canadian primarily fish and wildlife management people. So this isn't coming from a group of environmentalists or NGOs or necessarily policy people. It's largely a group of scientists that recognize that these are difficult decisions, and it's really about bringing science and policy and decision making together. So very much a governance issue. When you look at the global scale, policy and management around freshwater is indeed changing in many ways when it comes to recognizing environmental flows. And I've just pulled these three examples from quite a large report that WWF and the Nature Conservancy did on a global scale a while back, and I've got a slide coming up that has the title of that report in it for your reference. But for example, in China, they're developing river basin master plans that are trying to introduce environmental flows into those river basin master plans across the country. In New Zealand, the government has proposed a national standard establishing environmental flows and water levels that will influence all resource decisions, whether it's to take water or dam and divert water. South Africa, of course, is one of the best known examples where their National Water Act requires a reserve, and that reserve includes water for both basic human needs and the protection of aquatic ecosystems, and that be ensured, that reserve be ensured before water resources are allocated to other users. But there's a big but in all of this, and this is the conclusion of this report that was done by WWF and the Nature Conservancy, and that is that in the majority of cases, environmental flow provisions remain largely at the stage of policy and debate. So in some instances they are integrated into policy, in others they are at least part of the policy debate, but the implementation challenge, and that is the title of the report, the implementation challenge, is where the rubber needs to hit the road, and we're continuing to run into significant and in some cases what seem to be insurmountable challenges. But I'm not in favor of thinking that any challenge is insurmountable when it comes to water management. So I'll maybe carry on and get to a point where we can propose a way forward, at least for Canada. When we look at Canada, if we compare a couple quotes around environmental flows. First, looking to the past, the 1987 Federal Water Policy, to quote that document, it says that Canadians have tended to undervalue in-stream uses in water management decisions. 20-plus years later, a group that I am part of, the Forum for Leadership on Water, in the report that we worked on together called Changing the Flow, looking at the federal role in water policy, surmised that in-stream flows have fallen through the cracks in Canada. So when you look at it at this level, it appears that not a lot maybe has changed with respect to in-stream flows in Canada. But that may be not a fully fair assessment, given that much of the water management activity is happening at various levels of government, and in some cases at the ground level where changes may be happening, but it's not being made visible in these broader assessments. where environmental flows are emerging in Canada, I'll point to a few examples here of very promising, I think, initiatives across Canada where environmental flows are really taking center stage in water management. Of course, in British Columbia, the proposal for their new Water Sustainability Act, which is part of their Water Act modernization, which is part of the broader Living Water Smart initiative by the province of British Columbia, indicates that in-stream flows will be protected as an environmental value in that act. It's not perfect. There's many things to be discussed, and I've got some points to raise later in the presentation. But the fact that it's being considered is important. What needs to happen now is to ensure that it's not just given lip service, but actually integrated into policy and planning moving forward. In Alberta, under the Water for Life strategy, in-stream flows has been an ongoing issue. And I see that there's a couple folks much more up to date on this stuff on the line from Alberta Environment than I am, who are experts in the environmental flow field in that province. But one of the most interesting things that came out in the last couple of years, I guess in 2009, was advice to the Alberta Environment Minister provided by a group of experts that he solicited this advice from that suggests that the province needs to, there's an urgent need that the province establish protected water, which we could think of as synonymous with environmental flows, in order to protect the environment and aquatic ecosystems in all major river basins in the province. And, of course, that the government should not allocate water for consumptive uses where those allocations would reduce protected water below stipulated levels. Good policy statement, not unlike the challenge presented on the last slide. Moving from good policy statement to implementation is always a challenge. And recently, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans recommended a consistent national framework for the evaluation of in-stream flows be established for Canada, and that they do that through a science advisory process, and that advisory process should focus on ecosystem indicators for IFN or for in-stream flows, and include a consideration of potential climate effects on in-stream flows. And I saw also that Jane Stewart from CCME was on the line, so that reminded me that the CCME in their strategic directions on water are also suggesting that there is a need to share best management practices across the country when it comes to in-stream flow or ecosystem needs as it relates to water allocation and water budgeting. So certainly some movement at the policy level, as in the same way that we see it at the global level when we talk about environmental flows. This is the report that I referred to, the Implementation Challenge, Taking Stock of Government Policies to Protect and Restore Environmental Flows. This was released last year, a partnership between WWF and the Nature Conservancy, where they did a really long-term study, in-depth global look at policies around the world. I'll leave you to read the probably 100 or so pages of that report and learn what you will from it. I'll pull out what they identified as the three main implementation obstacles in that report. A lack of political will and stakeholder support. This notion that environmental flows necessarily implies reallocation of water from existing uses or constraining future uses, and that may not always be the case. In some cases it may be, but it's a knee-jerk response that this is about limiting growth, limiting economic activity, when in fact I would argue otherwise. The challenge of transcending political boundaries to focus on the watershed scale, where we have various jurisdictions, if you think in Canada, of the South Saskatchewan River Basin, crossing, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Mackenzie River Basin, including, 3 provinces, 2 territories, and a federal role. There's often a challenge when different jurisdictions have different approaches to water management, and some may or may not have different approaches to in-stream flow or environmental flow protection and regulation. And competing social and economic requirements and strong, often resistant lobbies to setting limits on water use or protecting environmental flows in rivers. There's often, we found in this report, insufficient resources and capacity, a lack of technical expertise, often institutional framework for water management and allocation that are not in line or primed to focus on environmental flows. And often constraints, as always in just about anything we do when it comes to public policy or environmental management, financial resources required to do the studies, to undertake the science, to run the multi-stakeholder decision-making processes, whatever it may be. There's financial resources involved in this, and they're often constrained. Institutional barriers. conflicts among various water management departments, agencies, ministries. That can be within governments, across governments. That doesn't only happen when you're talking about transboundary waters. Can happen within particular agencies or particular governments where certain agencies or departments have mandates that seem to be at cross purposes. And really thinking through the upstream-downstream relationships on a watershed scale, or the lack thereof. So that does get back to the transboundary discussion, and how the implications of changes to flow regimes upstream carry their way downstream, but there's often a lack of consideration of those downstream impacts in planning and policy. I'll move from that global look to reflect on our experience at WWF Canada of late with the policy and politics of implementation. These two report covers that you're looking at here relate to some work that Matt referred to early on. It was included in his bio, the work that we've been doing on working towards a new water management plan for the lower Athabasca River. The one to the left of the screen is the report published by the Phase 2 Framework Committee, which is the multi-stakeholder group that was struck to work through and try to reach consensus on a recommendation to the governments of Canada and Alberta on a new water management plan for the lower Athabasca River. That process, which sought to reach consensus, did not. At the end of 2 years and many dollars and many hours put into an effort that included representation by First Nations and Métis, environmental groups, federal and provincial government agencies, and industry, of course, the oil sands industry. We were unable to reach consensus, and the main sticking point in that that was impeding consensus was a concept Matt referred to in his part of the presentation, ecosystem base flow. And essentially, it illustrates well part of the implementation challenge. The policy side of it, there is a suggestion that implementation of an ecosystem base flow would conflict with the existing water rights of two of the major oil sands companies, the older oil sands companies, Suncor and Syncrude, who hold water rights that were really issued before protection and restoration of environmental flows were a major component of water management. The report then on the right-hand side is our effort to move this conversation along, and it's, I would say, in part of the politics of implementation, because what we're getting at here is trying to find a solution. And in that report, we call on both responsible governments to take the action. So this would be Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Alberta Environment, to take action on setting an ecosystem base flow. There was a threshold number established through the process that was agreed on by many parties, but were stalled at implementation. So again, when making these decisions, you're often challenged by a number of factors. Did you take the power from me here? Because I can't advance my slide. Yeah, I'm unable to advance the slide here.
My computer shows we're disconnected, and I'm on the phone.
Huh. Well, why don't I carry on with words?
Yeah. See
if we catch back up here with the technology. A big part of the challenge that we face is that we work in Canada under a very complex jurisdictional maze. There are roles for the federal government, whether it's in the Fisheries Act, Environmental Assessment Act, Species at Risk Act, Transboundary Water Agreements, all have implications or relate to environmental flows. And provincial and territorial policies, water rights and water allocation, licensing and of hydropower projects, water management planning, all elements of that relate to environmental flow protection. And then, of course, an increasing interest around Aboriginal water rights and what that means for environmental flows. if you bring that down to an example, and our example of the Athabasca River, and again, I'm a little bit limited here without being able to show you this on the slides, but the federal laws that relate to the process that we've been involved in include the Fisheries Act, Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and then project-specific approvals through SEA joint review panels. There are Aboriginal laws to be considered, obligations arising from Aboriginal land claims, treaty rights, constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights. And then at the provincial level, the Alberta Water Act, and primarily the water licenses issued to oil sands operators under the Alberta Water Act. And that most licenses have conditions, in fact, that reserve the right to establish an in-stream flow need on the quantity or rate of water that's diverted from the Athabasca River. So there are opportunities to influence environmental flows through the policy framework. That then takes hold through things like water management plans. In the Athabasca, there is an existing or Phase 1 water management plan that was seen by many as, well, it was viewed as an interim solution to the problem. We are now still working, as I mentioned, on the Phase 2 framework committee and hoping to see a much stronger water management plan emerge out the tail end of that process, which is still ongoing. I'm going to pause for a second here because it's told me I've got a failed connection.
We're still working on it, Tony.
Got it?
Never had this specific problem.
Right. Maybe I'll just should I continue on, Liz? I might as well, I guess, hey?
Yeah.
Just to note that there is, in this instance, there's been a long and ongoing push for environmental flows in the Athabasca River, in particular through a number of project approvals through CEAA or the SEA joint review panels. And in a number of instances, there's been recommendations that DFO and Alberta Environment collaborate on establishing an in-stream flow for the Athabasca River. So, I mean, that's meant to illustrate that when you do get into the decision-making process around establishing an in-stream flow prescription or water management rules related to in-stream flows, there are a lot of difficult decisions that have to be made and a lot of time that can go into making these decisions before you kind of get to a resolution. I thought I'd move from there to a bit of a proposal for how to move forward in the last couple slides. Oh, I may be getting back online here. Just pause for a second, sorry. All right, maybe not. Essentially, what we're suggesting as I wrap the presentation here is that an environmental flows framework for Canada needs to be goal-oriented and we could construct that around kind of three key concepts. Conserve, which would mean to avoid wasteful or destructive use of a resource. So that would mean conserve flows in those rivers that are still wild, that are not significantly impacted by major threats, major water withdrawals or flow regulation. There's a need to protect, to shield from further infringement or restriction. So protect flows in rivers that are being used but are not yet used or degraded to the point where we've seen significant environmental impacts. So I think the Athabasca would fit nicely into that example. We have an opportunity there to put in place a good water management plan before the river ends up in bad condition. And then, of course, there's a need to restore, to bring back or put back into a former or original state. So there's the challenge, and that is the big challenge, is to restore flows in overused or over-allocated rivers, rivers like the South Saskatchewan or the St. John in New Brunswick, where flows have been significantly disrupted. And, of course, the ideal is that, and the opportunity very much in Canada, is that we haven't messed up all of our rivers in the way we have in many parts of the world. So while we do have a need to look at some of these over-allocated and impacted rivers and restore, we are in many places in a situation where we still have the opportunity to protect and even conserve some wild rivers. So now, in my mind, is the time to be working hard on environmental flows and embedding this in water policy and planning across the country. So my final slide is about moving environmental flows forward in Canada and what is required in my mind, but I'm sure there's much more to be added to this list to begin moving forward on environmental flows on a national level.
Tony, can I just interrupt you for a minute?
Yep.
It's back up and running, and I see Matt online, but I don't see you because I think it's just your 902 number. Do you see anything on your screen?
Not yet. No, I'm just refreshing.
Okay, so what we'll do is finish off your presentation. You're doing a great job, and we'll take questions from those that are still on the line when you're done, and I'll just say them out loud to you. And you'll have to do it blind, but you're a superstar, so continue on.
Sounds good. And can you advance the slides to the last one before the thank you slide?
Yeah.
Great. And are you there now?
Am I am
Be number 42.
there. There now.
Good.
Moving e-flows forward in Canada, right?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Liz.
No problem.
So what do we need to do? I think first and foremost we need to try to change the conversation around environmental flows in Canada and have it be thought of less of a constraint and more as a foundation of sustainable water management. So it's not an environment versus economy conversation. A few months ago we held a workshop in Ottawa, and Sandra Postel nailed this point in a really wonderful way and said that it's actually by setting these constraints it will drive up the value of water, it will drive up efficiency of water because it will be of a higher value, that will protect and restore ecosystems, and that will result in innovations in water management. So it's not about environment against economy, it's really about environment and a new economy as it relates to water management. We do need to work on science tools. I alluded to the recommendation from DFO of the need for a national framework for evaluating environmental flows. And I think that would move us along a long way in this country if there was guidance that provinces, water management agencies could look to, so we have a uniform approach to evaluation of environmental flows across the country. Priority setting guidelines. The Athabasca is one of a number of examples where there's been pretty intensive programs or projects undertaken to identify, assess, and try to implement environmental flows. But this takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. And it's not necessarily the case that we need to do that in-depth of a study for every river in Canada in order to protect or restore or conserve environmental flows. So we need some sort of priority setting guidelines, a triage approach that says, you know what, these rivers for now are actually in pretty good condition, so if we just recognize that and keep an eye on them and focus our attention on those protection and maybe restoration, we can use resources and our capacity most efficiently. A national framework for monitoring and reporting on river health, I think, is probably a critical piece of this because it will allow us to, at an understandable and national level, to understand if we're doing a good job in terms of protecting and restoring environmental flows and overall implications of that for river health. In terms of law and policy reform, it would be nice if we had law and policy protect wild rivers in the way that the U.S. has the National Wild and Scenic River Act, which lists rivers that can be protected from major development. We lack something similar on the national scale in Canada, and as I noted, I think we still have a major opportunity to practice traditional conservation of wild rivers in this country, and they should be afforded legal protection. Environmental flow standards embedded in provincial water rights and water allocation laws. Matt's second variant or variation of the sustainability boundary concept, there's some work going on right now that is not yet released, but I can tell you that is leaning towards what's being referred to as presumptive standards around the sustainability boundary that will say as you move away from the natural flow regime in either direction, more water or less water, you increasingly increase your ecological risk. And there's some work being developed or done to propose some essentially risk bands around the natural flow regime that can work as guidance as a first cut in terms of establishing environmental flows in instances where there's not the resources at hand or maybe necessary to do an in-depth study in the way that we have in the Athabasca or other places. Legally enforceable water management plans, in instances where their environmental flows have been embedded, it's often the case that there's not a strong or clear legal backing of those plans. So ideally we have legal protections, as we do in many parts of the world, for protecting and restoring environmental flows. Fisheries and species laws to explicitly protect environmental flows where we have species at risk, and flow regimes are critical to protecting and restoring those species. Those laws need to be implemented. And when it comes to hydropower, there's a growing interest, I believe, internationally in a framework for responsible or sustainable hydropower, and that should influence not just how dams are operated, but where new hydropower facilities are being proposed, that it influences their planning, so where they are located on a watershed scale, and their design as well. So that's my kind of prescription, but I'm sure it's far from complete for how we can move the agenda forward in Canada. And with that, and a few glitches along the way, and I thank all those who hung on for the duration of the presentation, I will say thank you. Liz, just so you know, I'm back online. I can see things now, so I guess we'll take questions.
Just in time for that thank you slide. We like to keep our speakers on their toes. So thank you, and it seems like we have more people on the call now than we did before, so I wonder if it's because this was so popular that it might have just had a backlog of people trying to enter the room, and maybe it shut things down. But anyways, thank you everyone for being patient and staying on the call. We're going to take questions now, and we have a couple that were sent to us from people who couldn't attend. We're going to start with one from Oliver, who asks, Oliver Brandis from Polis, in concrete terms, what would you recommend to a jurisdiction that, sorry, I'm just scrolling down, that might be considering setting up a system that builds e-flows into a legal regime? I understand ideally a detailed basin-by-basin planning approach would be preferred, but does it make sense to set a kind of safety standard, at least initially, that can provide a placeholder while the planning process occurs, which we all know can take years? Would something like 20 to 50% of mean flow be a reasonable starting point for a boundary, quote unquote? Do you need to repeat that? And that might be something for both you and Matt.
Yeah, no, I get the question. I can start. And Matt, if you have thoughts to add to this, but what I would say is that I think it gets to some of the points I was trying to make at the end. Is I think there needs to be a kind of triage system, so that you do identify places where it is critical to dig in and do the water management planning that is necessary, so that you don't lose very threatened rivers or aquatic ecosystems while you're waiting for the kind of rest of the framework to fall in place. So I think you have to have some sort of triage that says these ones are okay, these ones are mid-range, but there's some that we really need to focus on now, and that should have some criteria around it to make that identification. And then I think the use of, and Matt may have another thought about this, 20-50% of mean annual flow. I would lean more so to looking at it in terms of that natural flow regime and think about deviation or movement away from the natural flow regime and building in some key components rather than just mean annual flow. What that risk band around the natural flow regime gets you is a focus on the intra-annual variability that's so important. So you're not just moving away from mean annual flow, looking at mean annual flow. You're looking at, say, 10 to 15% away from the natural flow regime, whether it's higher flows or lower flows from natural. You're in a, let's say, a mid-risk band, and further away you're at a high-risk band, so that you can set some standards that way. And that's the way the work that's ongoing around this presumptive standard is being rolled out.
Great, thanks. Matt, did you have something to add to that?
No, I think that's good, and yeah, I agree with Tony. It's about a deviation from the natural flow regime, and I think also what would be very important to have in kind of like sort of a desktop sort of method would be a protection of those low flows. So a deviation from the natural standard, but also a point at which at the point at which the natural flow regime is left, the natural flow is left in the river, so that ecosystem-based flow concept. And once you have that sort of desktop model in place, you could do more detailed, I guess, assessments to see whether that needs to be relaxed or not. But I think a protective presumptive standard, as Tony mentioned, that has a deviation from the natural flow regime and has that low flow kind of cutoff, I guess you could say, would be a good starting point.
Great, thanks. We also have, we have a couple of specific actions by, questions about specific actions on WWF's actions. The first one, does WWF have a plan to influence government policy and procedure development? Tony, I'll give that one to you.
Yes, I just can't tell you what it is. It's sneaky and devious.
Okay.
No, we certainly do. But the challenge that you face is that the complex jurisdictions here. You're talking about many governments. In fact, releasing a report like Rivers at Risk is part of our way of influencing not just government, but all those involved in water management, society as a whole. They're thinking around this issue. But certainly, I mean, through initiatives like the Phase 2 framework planning process, we learned a ton and made a lot of headway on this issue by touching ground with the concept and working alongside government officials from the federal and provincial governments, as well as other NGOs and First Nations, Métis.
And another question about your specific actions, have you guys submitted comments to Ontario's LRIA technical guidelines draft out for review on the EDR?
No, we have not.
And are there any specific methods that have been used or are being adopted to determine IFN within Canada? For example, ecological limits of hydrological alteration?
Matt?
I have not seen ELOHA, so ecological limits of hydrologic alteration, applied in Canada. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been, but I haven't seen it. The first I saw about it was a journal article published in 2010, so I haven't seen that methodology done. But some methods that have been done, habitat suitability curves have been used in the Athabasca and South Saskatchewan River Basin. Riparian vegetation in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, some indicators for that, as well as some work was done in the Athabasca, at least trying to get to the flows required to flood perch basins in the Peace Athabasca Delta. So I guess, so to answer the question, not to my knowledge, not on the ELOHA, but there has been a number of different methods used, as well as kind of pure hydrology methods used in other river basins as well. So a number of things have been used in Canada.
And I think, Matt, maybe you can take this next question. How would you deal with a variation between years, especially for geomorph extreme years, which can be crucial?
Good question. I think that for geomorphology, I'm not an expert in there, but I think an approach that allows a percent reduction of flow to be taken would preserve that interannual variation. So you'd be only taking a percent at wet and dry years, so you can continue to have those that interannual variation. But in terms of geomorphology, I don't know specific methodologies to discuss in terms of how to protect that specific component of environmental flows.
Okay. And another question from Angela is, how is sustainability boundaries determined, and how would you suggest determining a flow requirement in a stretch of river between a dam and a tail race outlet?
Well, I can answer the first part of that question, and the sustainability boundary, at least as proposed in Richter's paper, would have to be determined using one of 200, I guess, environmental flow methodologies. So it could be that percent reduction from flow using hydrology methods, or more detailed analysis linking flow and habitat indicators, habitat suitability curves, etc. I do not know the second part of the question, how to determine a flow requirement in a stretch of river between a dam and a tail race outlet. My experience mainly has been with water withdrawal scenarios and not hydro operations. So, unfortunately, I'm not able to help on that one.
I'll just add in there on the first part of the question that if you're able to come up with some semblance of the natural flow regime, or have let's say a pre major development or major impact hydrograph, then these presumptive standards that are being developed would help to, from a desktop perspective at least, begin to define a sustainability boundary by having risk bands associated, on either side of the sustainability boundary, whether it's because of adding more flow because of releases from a dam, or having less flow because you're downstream of a dam, or having major water withdrawal. So that would be a first pass, and then I think, of course, as Matt said, moving to the more detailed analysis in terms of a planning and science-based approach.
Great, thanks. And also, I would recommend and encourage anyone who might have some answers or references for Angela to either chat to her privately or as a group, whichever you feel comfortable with. But before I move on to more questions, Tony, did you have anything to add to any of the questions? They were a bit science-based, but if you have anything to add, feel free to do so.
Yeah, no, that's why you got two of us. We're dividing and conquering.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Marilyn's question then. What were your lessons learned, so to speak, for example, through your involvement in the Phase 2 process, and that was in Alberta, around the Lower Athabasca, for anyone who might not know what she's referring to, and specifically with regards to having First Nations and Métis involved in setting environmental flows.
You got thoughts there, Matt?
Yeah, and I guess I should start off by saying, unfortunately, that the Phase 2 process did have First Nation and Métis involvement, but some of the First Nations groups downstream of the Athabasca River, so located in the Peace Athabasca Delta, chose not to participate in the table, and so I can say that it definitely would have been a more complete process had they participated, and they had the reasons not to. But from the experience specifically of having them at the table, the traditional knowledge of river definitely helped in developing some of the criteria and assessments and linking, I guess, local knowledge and Western science definitely helped in some indicators of how to assess environmental flows. And also with regards to the specific process, the First Nations that did not participate also have since released a report linking environmental flows and traditional uses for the Athabasca River, and that type of knowledge I know has been submitted to regulators for consideration in the development of the final Phase 2 framework. So definitely a huge role to play, but as I said, unfortunately in the Athabasca process we didn't have all the stakeholders at the table to move forward.
Can I just throw one comment in, and I'm just trying to do this to illustrate what is often a very complex conversation around environmental flows, and it has to do with the difference between an ecosystem-based flow, which is what one of the key things that we went to the table with, and that is, as Matt articulated, a low flow threshold in the river, at which point all water withdrawals or all further water withdrawals should cease. So it's a threshold, and in the Athabasca River, that low flow threshold happens when the lowest flow happens when the river is flowing under ice, so the middle of the winter. In the work that Matt referred to by some First Nations groups relating flows to their traditional uses, there was some confusion that what they were proposing was a higher threshold for an ecosystem-based flow, but in fact, the thresholds that they were proposing related to use of the river at different times of the year, primarily for navigation, and clearly that's not when the river is frozen over. So it was at a different time of year, but out in the public domain there was some confusion around whose threshold is right, and in fact it's very likely that both are right because they're for different points on the natural hydrograph, or the hydrograph of the river.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Are river roundtables on local levels common throughout Canada?
I think I would probably say that not common enough. I think one of the key things that would be great to see around this country is a greater conversation around water management at the ecosystem level and local level in Canada. But I think that in part that can't depend wholly on only local advocates or local interests coming forward and creating these things, that there needs to be some rationale and help and resources put forward by governments who are ultimately responsible for water management.
Okay, and, oh, sorry, Matt, did you have anything to add?
Nope, that's good.
Okay, and Tony, a great lead into the next question about government putting resources up. We have a question about, or can you provide any comments on Environment Canada's approach of reducing flow station or gauging station networks?
That it's bad. That, you know, we've seen monitoring of water across this country in decline over the last few decades, including flow gauging stations. You know, the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, this is one of the things that he highlighted in his report this year. So, you know, I think as Matt pointed out with the adaptive management framework, in terms of being able to monitor long-term trends related to the impacts of climate change on hydrology, we need more, not less, monitoring and gauging stations, and other ways of keeping track of where water is being used, how much, and where it's flowing.
Great, and we have 5 more minutes for the call, so I'm just going to encourage everyone to, or anyone who has any questions, to start typing and get those last questions in. But we have one question from the University of Guelph. In your opinion, what is or are the most immediate research gaps that should be tackled by academia? I think there's some master's students fishing for some thesis ideas.
I wonder what would you say to that, Matt, from your perspective?
I think well, one thing in the Athabasca that, I mean, perhaps the product of the period of concern mainly being when the river's covered in ice, but I think there has been a lot of great environmental flows work and assessments done in open water season throughout Canada, but unfortunately in many parts of Canada, a lot of the time, or at least a chunk of the year, rivers are covered in ice, and an understanding of biology under ice and habitat use and et cetera, I would say is a little bit behind compared to open water season, and I think that type of information would definitely forward environmental flow assessments and from the assessment side. That's kind of the one that comes to my mind. I think continued development of the models and tools, but that's fairly general. So I would say under ice assessment would be one of mine.
I think if I were to weigh in on, well, maybe I'd add to that. I think we're always in need of a better understanding around future scenarios around climate change is probably something that we need to get far better at in downscaling climate hydrology models to closer to the river and watershed level. At the policy perspective level, I think that one of the key things that we need to wrap our heads around, that goes back to Oliver's first question, is how do you develop a policy framework and legal regime that allows for questions that allows you to influence and protect environmental flows in the absence often of complete information or the resources to do in-depth studies. So it would be great to understand how this implementation challenge at that much more refined level has been tackled in other parts of the world, and I think that's something that's certainly on my mind.
Great, that's perfect, and just in time for the next question. Assuming water markets, do you anticipate environmental values participating successfully in... Oh, I think this question means if water markets were established, do you anticipate environmental values participating successfully in such a framework?
I guess, if I understand correctly, I think to me it's how... nature can't participate, in my mind, on itself. It has no voice in a market. So that automatically means there needs to be some mechanism through which environmental values can participate. And that, of course, needs to come back to well-meaning and inspired and empowered humans advocating or acting on behalf of the environment. I would my take on, just generally, on, if you think back to the sustainability boundary concept, is that we can't and probably shouldn't rely on a market to define what that boundary is, but there may be, with the appropriate constraints in place and monitoring of market mechanisms, the potential for markets to allocate water to the most highly valued uses within that sustainability boundary. But you know, kind of classically, the market on its own can't necessarily define what limits are.
Great, thanks, Tony. And we have time for one, maybe a second question. And we have one more. Presumptive approach sounds like DFO practice in setting risk-based cutoffs in fisheries and habitat management. Any value in synthesizing approaches and arguing that environmental flows and sustainability boundary setting is already widely accepted in policy, at least in theory?
Boy, I feel like I'm in grad school again. I'm just going to reread this because it's in front of me.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly where those approaches, I hope I'm on the right train here, where those approaches are similar in nature, that synthesizing them certainly makes sense, and bringing environmental flows together with risk-based cutoffs for habitat and habitat management. I think the trick there is to have it articulated and a framework for applying it beyond theory and beyond just policy on paper. So that's where I think the rubber probably needs to hit the road, is to get it down to the implementation level in terms of not just developing risk-based guidelines or presumptive standards, but actually implementing them on the ground. Hope I answered you there, Rod.
And Matt, did you have anything to add?
No, not on that question, but I'll cheat and go back to the question about water markets. And I think Tony answered very well that I think the preferred approach is to have aquatic ecosystem needs and social needs protected, and if market is selected as a allocation tool, to have that use that to relook at the quote unquote surplus water above environmental and social needs. But water markets have been used successfully for environmental protection in the western United States, and as well they're being used in Australia. There's been some government commitment to buying back water licenses, and although that does sound distasteful to have to use market to protect environmental values, it has been used elsewhere. So just wanted to add that to the mix.
Those are fighting words, Matt. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. I think we're done with questions. I see a few people typing, but maybe the questions will be written by the time I've done with my business. So first of all, thank you very much, Tony and Matt. I just want to make sure everyone's questions were addressed. So if, because of the small technical glitch, if somehow your question didn't get put up on the chat box, please send them to Brad, who's been communicating with everyone, and we will send them on to Matt and Tony before the end of the day, and then when we send out the summary of the webinar, we'll ensure those questions are included. Just so everyone's aware, the PowerPoint for today is available on waterpolicy.ca site. It's a PDF, and we will work on the recording. It might be in 2 pieces now, but we'll get that up onto the waterpolicy.ca site as soon as possible. And I think that's it. Thank you again. One last closing point is that I love having things come full circle, and all the discussion about implementation of environmental flows and how to get the policy into action was where we actually started this webinar series with our first webinar where Rob Delow joined us. So thank you, Tony and Matt, for bringing that full circle. It was a nice finish. And thank you to all the participants for joining us. And I will finish off for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Thank you.
that they're causing